Kamehame blah. It's Dragon Power on episode 76 of NES Works.
Together forever.
It's a real winner of an episode this week. 2 games from some of the all-time NES greats. First, we have Dragon Power from TOSE and Bandai, and then Ikari Warriors II from Micronics and SNK. If you're excited, just imagine how I feel. The TOSE Bandai combo isn't always the worst thing in the world. After all, Ninja Kid was okay. This week's collaboration, however, is anything but okay. It's actually quite awful. And, in fact, really the only saving grace to it is that Dragon Power has an interesting legacy and story behind it. As with just about all the Bandai releases we've seen so far for NES, Dragon Power began life in Japan as a tie-in with a manga and anime property. What makes this game interesting is that the property it's based on would eventually become a huge deal outside of Japan, which paints Dragon Power in a totally different light today. Very few people in America today care about Obake no Kyutaro or Gegege no Kitaro, meaning very few people who grew up owning Chubby Cherub or Ninja Kid have gone back and had a sudden eureka moment with those games. On the other hand, Dragon Power's source material, Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball franchise, would go on to be extremely well known around the world, which causes Dragon Power to radiate a disorienting sensation of cognitive dissonance all these years later. In keeping with their standard practices, Bandai has only changed a few key details of the game in its journey to the West. The protagonist's sprite has changed from the beloved childhood version of Goku into a small monkey child named Goku, which perhaps inadvertently brings the game closer to the manga's loose inspiration, the venerable Chinese novel, Journey to the West, in which a being known as the Monkey King traveled across Asia with the help of an enchanted cloud and bow staff. Here, Toriyama's perverted turtle hermit, Master Roshi, has become just a generic old man, and his infamous obsession with the underwear of young girls has literally been turned upside down. In the original Japanese game, Roshi demanded Goku's teenage companion Bulma surrender her panties in exchange for the hermit's help. That wouldn't pass Nintendo of America's content standards, so the programmers just flipped the panty sprite upside down and decided the hermit should be inexplicably obsessed with Bulma, or rather Nora's, sandwiches. Lacy, frilly sandwiches with cute pink bows. The game is unreasonably difficult thanks to its sloppy design. Even with infinite health active, it's still possible to hit a brick wall in the level where you work your way through a tedious maze of caves and houses, only to die instantly when the boss of the rabbit mob touches you and transforms you into a carrot as you struggle with the miserable controls to reach the pole that allows you to defeat the boss. Anyway, in both versions of the game, players take control of a little guy named Goku, who theoretically excels at martial arts. His supposed martial skill manifests as the ability to punch a very short distance ahead with a slightly overlarge fist, which feels a bit like a riff on Sega's similarly simian Alex Kidd, except both this game and Alex Kidd debuted in Japan the same month, November 1986, which means it's another case of just one of those things. And unlike Alex Kidd, which played out as a side-scroller with weird boss battles, Dragon Power is more of a 3/4 top-down thing in the Zelda style. Though it does have weird boss battles, in the sense that the action will suddenly shift to a side perspective, which makes it a strange coincidental inverse of Alex Kidd. As you roam through the game's small stages, you can punch bad guys, who will drop power-ups. You can also drop into hidden areas where you can fight monsters, collect treasure, and earn power-ups. Although the perspective here resembles The Legend of Zelda or the connective Garloz region of Rygar, Dragon Power is very definitely not an exploratory adventure in the style of those games. It's far more shallow, with the top-down sections more or less playing out as linear action sequences, every bit as rudimentary and straightforward as any linear platformer. The hidden caves add a small bit of interest, but ultimately this is a sloppy, brain-dead action game dressed up in action RPG drag. Goku does have a few fleeting skill upgrades available should he acquire the proper power-up icons. The most practical of these is the bow staff, which of course is meant to be Noibo, Goku's magical staff from the manga. It's quite a bit less magical here, since you lose it every time you complete a stage and have to find a new power-up icon. It does help while you wield it though, giving Goku considerably better attack range than his paltry bare fist provides. You can also get a special boost that causes Goku to launch a spinning attack while wielding the bow, which is handy, if a bit loose and sloppy in terms of gameplay, and naturally you can earn a wave projectile attack, the famous Kamehameha, a riff on the Hawaiian king Kamehameha, that also happens to mean roughly turtle wave attack in Japanese. The Kamehameha is pretty difficult to use effectively since you have to hold down the attack button until Goku enters his attack stance, then press the A button. And even then it's not particularly powerful. All told, it's a pretty limited game. Your task is to find the 7 missing crystals or Dragon Balls and use them to summon the dragon god Shenron, which you accomplish by traipsing through stage after stage of tepid action before facing bosses and mini-bosses that crowd you against the edge of the screen and sap your health constantly as you attack them. Boss battles in Dragon Power are tedious battles of attrition. But on the plus side, sometimes they're vaguely recognizable as characters from the anime, such as Yamcha. Not that anyone playing Dragon Power in March 1988 had the first clue what the actual anime was. While we'll see a few instances of NES games based on manga licenses being released in the US in conjunction with some early attempts by Viz Comics at localizing the source material pretty soon, most notably Golgo 13 and Fist of the North Star, Viz wouldn't translate the Dragon Ball manga for another decade. Dragon Power also predates the first attempts to bring the Dragon Ball anime to the US by nearly 2 years. Carl Macek and Harmony Gold, of Robotech infamy, would make another one of their fidelity be damned attempts to bring a Japanese cartoon into English with Dragon Ball starting in 1989. While not quite as radical an overhaul as Robotech or Warriors of the Wind, that early Dragon Ball dub changed basically every imaginable detail, but it was also seen by almost no one. Harmony Gold's Dragon Ball was rumored to have debuted in the US as early as 1987, but based on home tapes unearthed in March 2020, the Lost Media Wiki has determined that the show actually debuted in December 1989 on some affiliate stations in the Detroit area. In other words, Dragon Power was a licensed game that shipped in the US unmoored to its original property, and which has become a standard bearer for the counterproductive Japanese to English localization efforts of the 8-bit era in hindsight. It would be neat if there were a good game to go along with this good story, but there's not. It's your usual sloppy, shallow, and balanced rush job, TOSE being capable of making perfectly good games, but only when given proper support by their publisher, which was never Bandai's forte. Now, the second part of this week's episode comes to us from Micronics, working for SNK. Ikari Warriors II maintains this combination's batting average of 0, though at least this time you get the impression they were actually trying to hit the ball. Ikari Warriors II was simply called Victory Road in the arcades, and it's only obliquely a sequel to the first Ikari Warriors. The coin-op version carried forward the original game's unique rotary joystick, enabling independent movement and firing. But aside from that control mechanic, they only resemble one another in the broad strokes. The NES game introduces the plot with what appears to be a link to the ending of the first Ikari Warriors, with the protagonist being given a plane to fly home in for a hero's welcome. Ralph and Clark, or rather Vince and Paul as they were inexplicably renamed here, get caught up in some sort of freak lightning storm, which takes them to the planet Alexia Lambda. There, a blobby green guy asks them to rescue the planet from the diabolical forces of Zhang Zip. No more fighting human soldiers in semi-realistic military settings here. Victory Road takes place in bizarre-looking alien environments where you battle bizarre-looking aliens. Bosses mostly consist of large, grotesque floating heads. And Victory Road makes plenty of mechanical changes to the formula too. For starters, there are no longer tanks and helicopters to commandeer. This whole game takes place on foot. Then again, there's not really room for tanks and choppers, as Vince and Paul have become surprisingly large in this outing. The arcade game beefed up the player sprites both in terms of their actual pixel resolution and in terms of their musculature, and the NES game follows suit. These are some large lads, and the scale of the game world changes around them. Everything feels a little more crowded, and everything seemingly moves a little more slowly, especially the protagonists. Accordingly, there are fewer threats on screen at any given time than in Ikari Warriors, and they don't tend to crowd the player quite as much here. The disconnect between the arcade machine's bespoke controller and the NES D-pad remains in effect, but the developers have made moving and aiming a tiny bit more effective by allowing you to lock your firing position by holding down the B button to shoot as you move. The NES game still doesn't work anywhere near as well as the unique move and fire controls of the coin-op, but there is a certain degree of independence in the controls that makes a world of difference. Or it would if not for the fact that the characters move so damn slowly. It doesn't really matter that you can aim more effectively and have fewer hazards to dodge when the act of dodging is more like watching your character's inevitable doom play out in slow motion. Ikari Warriors 2 may not be as maddening as the first game in many respects, but it's still a miserable slog. And yet, they tried. God bless them, Micronics really made an effort here. Not only are the character sprites larger and more detailed, the background graphics have an elaborate alien style that looks far more distinct than the generic grassy patches and brick walls of the first game. Sure, they make use of garish color palettes that turn many areas into retina-searing horrors, But there is some furtive acknowledgement of the existence of the word aesthetic here. Likewise, the alien enemies are unlike any monsters yet seen on NES, misshapen and grotesque by design. They're often admittedly indecipherable, and the larger foes blink in and out of visibility due to the programming's poor handling of the system's sprite limitations, but an effort was made. And the game has destructible environments too. You can shatter certain walls and barriers with your grenades to reveal alternate paths, hidden rooms, and handy power-ups. True, the collision detection on grenades requires precise hits that the game engine and controls don't really support, but you have to admire the attempt. Even more interestingly, the NES version completely revamps the game's weapon system. Where the arcade original used a fairly straightforward scheme wherein collecting a blinking icon caused your character's current weapon to switch over accordingly, here the icons serve a different purpose. Each hero has a permanent weapons loadout of 4 different guns or blades, and 2 types of thrown projectiles. And once you collect icons for each weapon, you can swap between them at any time by jumping to a menu system. A menu system in a Micronics game. Amazing. Now yes, it's true that pulling up the menu is a tortuous process thanks to an inexplicable loading time that causes the screen to go black and glitch out for 2 or 3 seconds as you switch between the action and the menu. But still, wow, selectable weapons. And better yet, collecting a weapon icon doesn't force you to use that weapon. It simply boosts that weapon's power up to 4 times. Not only that, but you can buy upgrades. That's right, the NES version of Victory Road adds an economy that simply didn't exist in arcades. It honestly and truly feels like Micronics took stock of what their competitors were doing in the NES space and said, we need to do this as well. And so you have currency that allows you to purchase better weapons and health refills in shops you find along the way, just like in Gunsmoke, while toggling weapons to better battle hideous aliens, as in Contra. Ikari Warriors II is not a patch on either Contra or Gunsmoke. It's slow, ugly, choppy, and awkward. But seeing Micronics of all studios take such an aggressive approach to improving, or at least adding on to, an arcade conversion really warms the heart. After all the dire, unpleasant product the studio has served up so far in NES works, Ikari Warriors 2 feels like there's hope, even for the hopeless. This game isn't good, but it's the most interesting thing Micronics has delivered since their perfectly competent conversion of elevator action. And that's not even getting into the bizarre portals that you can fall into, forcing you to battle through strange, self-contained combat sequences. Or the way shady bars serve as shops, where you can either purchase upgrades or battle alien warriors for extra cash. Or the fact that that cash takes the form of hearts. Not fun Castlevania or Zelda-style Valentine heart icons, but bizarre, pulsating black alien hearts rippling with blood-engorged red veins. And then there's the infuriating final battle, where the green guy who slowly talks to you during the attract mode turns out to be the real boss. He challenges you to a duel in which you're forced to attack him with a short-range sword, while somehow, at the same time, slowly evading his projectiles. Lose, and even the built-in ABBA continue code won't allow you to advance any further. It's frustrating and bad. Frankly, Ikari Warriors 2 is downright weird and not fun to play in the least, but it is at least utterly fascinating, and I have to feel like that counts for something. After all, isn't a bad, interesting game more notable than one that is dull, but ultimately middling? I have to think so. Next time on NES Works, the true ice hockey hat trick: fat, medium, and skinny.